Hello, welcome back, class. This is the second part, session 1, where we're going to start talking about the history, the methods, and the theories within cultural anthropology. And we're going to first start, and we're not going to cover all the theorists. In this case, you would be taking a specialized course that would only cover theory in anthropology. But we're going to be going through a series of histories and theorists that have had great contribution to this field. Let me go to our main screen and bring up our PowerPoint. Here we go. All right. Well, we will be looking at several modes of expression when we're looking at culture. And we'll be looking at symbols, at histories, myths, mythologies, which are kind of the origin stories, rituals, and also ideas of how man sees himself, herself in the cosmos, in relationship to the universe. And this is why it's important to just have a brief introduction and cover some of the theories, the history and the theories that have contributed to this field of study. And so you can also understand where we obtained our methods and our applications. Now, in a previous lecture, I invited Dr. Lopez to give you a history of the era of encounters, of colonization, to explain how these ideas of race came about. And this was in the topic when we were talking about biological anthropology and the contribution on how it's trying to look at the human genome, looking at geneticists and trying to debunk these ideas of race. But here I'm going to briefly cover the history of how we came, what gave rise to this field of anthropology. And we cannot ignore this emerged with the era of encounters, the era of colonization, where there was explorations of different lands and different people, where they came about, and we had different people from different parts of the world encounter, and in some cases, such as in the case of Latin America and the Americas in general, the age of colonialization. So the first anthropologist that I will introduce in a bit, Edward Taylor, they were considered armchair anthropologists because they took their information, their curiosity about humans and about different cultures. They took their information from the missionaries. Now, the missionaries were one of the first to start documenting, writing memoirs of their encounters. But one of the issues with this is that we're getting a perspective from their point of view, and also the way their cosmology and the way they were viewing other humans. And in the case of the Americas, when they encountered the indigenous people, they set out with this idea of colonization and also religious conversion. So the way they viewed their practices, their way of life, and so forth, they viewed them very contrary to their belief system, and therefore they were doing something that was incorrect and needed to be saved or converted. And from these missionary memoirs and documentation, because in many cases they had to report back to, in the case of the encounter of New Spain, of Latin America, they had to report back and provide reports of how they have achieved conversion, how many indigenous people they are saving, and so forth. So we get different encounters from this. In some cases, they were very harsh and carried out severe punishment and forceful conversion, and they would view indigenous people as almost non-human. In other cases, we have memoirs from missionaries like Bartolomé de las Casas, which worked with indigenous community in the area of Chiapas, Mexico, where he came back and argued to the king, and it provides a series of books and memoirs explaining how advocating for the rights of indigenous people, advocating for humanitarian treatment, advocating to respect their way of life, and so forth. And in other cases, in the case of Mani, Yucatan, we have situations that took place to where has left many archaeologists and anthropologists trying to piece back together some, this puzzle, because the Mayas had extensive writing. They had extensive calendars and written documentation. They were one of the few indigenous people that did have an elaborate system of writing. So when Diego de Landa was a Franciscan that was sent to this area of New Spain, Mexico, and he specialized in the area of the Yucatan Peninsula, and he learned the Mayan language. He lived among the Mayas with this idea of conversion, of saving them, of saving them as being sinners and so forth. So he was part of what led the Holy Inquisition. Those that were not saved or converted, therefore were demonic and evil and would be punished in these crucifixions, these inquisitions in public displays to pass along the message to others. Now, Diego de Landa had spent many, many years in this region, and like I said, had learned the language, had learned the customs, was educating local Mayas on learning Spanish and teaching them about Christianity. However, there was, when he discovered that the Mayas were still continuing their belief system, their practice, their offerings in clandestine locations such as caves, he went on this rant. He was so furious. He felt he had been dubbed lied to, and therefore he convinced the leader to send him an army to lead this inquisition among the Yucatan. And it is from this, this is one of those encounters that, like I said, historically has left many archaeologists and anthropologists, almost in tears, saying, look at all this information that was lost. Because what he carried out, as I mentioned, the Mayans had extensive writing. He carried out to raid villages and seek out the Mayan leaders. In many cases, there were Mayan priests, prophets, there were Mayan leaders, community leaders, and he sought out to either kill them, but also collect information that people had, any writing, any effigies, anything that would link people to their identity and to their origins. He had it burned. And this was a massive burning where he burned many codices and many books of prophets. This is the area, this connects a series of small towns where I specialize in doing my field work, and I call it the the area of the Chilambalam, because in this area the prophetic books of the Chilambalam, the Mayan prophets, were found. Many were burned, and from what we know is, for example, when a Mayan prophet would be having a vision, he would have initiates or other Mayan prophets around him to write down what he was seeing. And from this is where we get the prophecies of the Chilambalam, because there were a couple of surviving texts that survived the burning of Diego Lalanda, the auto de fe, the act of faith, this event that took place in 1562. All right, so this gives you an idea of the Age of Encounters. And the Age of Encounters were not only in the Americas. This was taking place all over the world, in Africa, China, India, etc. So Dr. Lopez talked a bit about that and how this gave rise to this idea of seeing the other. In many cases, like I said, where the field of anthropology comes into play is to collect the memoirs from these missionaries that kept detailed memoirs and wrote letters back and forth to either their bishop or their leaders to convince them of certain acts that they had to carry out, as in this case, the famous auto de fe of Mani Yucatan. Okay, so from the fast forward into the era of the scientific revolution. By the 1800s, mid 1900s, Europe had already gone an era of scientific revolution. They had already gone a revolution separating church and knowledge. By this time, as we had mentioned, pretty much the church controlled all the knowledge, all the forms of education, all forms of writing, information. Only certain people that were part of the church were able to obtain education. And so from the era of the scientific revolution came about this debate of there is a different method to trying to understand our environment, to trying to understand how things work. We can't depend solely on the information derived from the church. And the ideas from this revolution, the ideas of science, of philosophy came about. We have the emergence of trying to understand how things work using a rationale and an empirical method. This would be the scientific method. Trying to apply these things, how to understand how things work. Well, you must study it using your five senses. You must understand how something works using a material explanation. In other words, trying to look at the functionality, the rationale, and also be able to apply it from a material perspective. So from this emerged Charles Darwin. During Darwin's time, he set on a voyage in different parts of the world, collecting different species. He collected a series of birds and plants, and he began to pay attention to the different types of, in particular of birds, of beaks, and how in certain environments these beaks were very different. They were different as they had to access certain foods in their environment. And so from these ideas of looking at a series of different species and plants and so forth, he came up with this idea of evolution. of natural selection, how an organism shared a common ancestors. In the case of birds, he mentioned, well, there must be a common ancestor among birds in which they slowly adapted according to their environment to have access to resources, to have access to foods. So Darwin's idea of natural selection is looking at how species, how organisms reproduce, and they reproduce in order to improve their adaptation to their environment. Now, from this, and this time, Darwin came from a very wealthy family, and he also married someone that was very wealthy as well. So this allowed him to carry out voyages and have his own private lab and be able to explore. He came from his family. His grandfather was also a naturalist. They were interested in looking at nature and trying to understand how nature works. Now, from this, Darwin never applied his theory to humans. And this is very important because many times this idea that we'll talk about next with Herbert Spencer goes back to Darwin. Darwin does not mention the evolution of humans. He mentions that from this information, we may be able to understand the evolution of humans. But you also have to understand that every theorist that we present here, you can better understand it by going back in history and looking at what was going on at their point in time, what was going on in their era. In the case of Darwin, he took over 2 decades to publish his information. Even though he came from a wealthy family and he married into a wealthy family, nonetheless, he knew that his information was very dangerous because at that time, Europe was still slowly moving away from information being controlled and dictated by the church. Anything that would go against these beliefs would be considered dangerous, and in many cases, he could even be killed. So it was Darwin's brother that had the courage to mostly present his ideas and publications, encourage his publications. Now, again, Darwin knew by understanding biology, he had his own greenhouse, understanding how certain plants, cross-mating certain plants and looking at their growth and what would happen to them. He married his first cousin, and from this he always felt very guilty. The fact that some of his children had this genetic deficiency to where I believe he lost about 3 children. His youngest daughter, Annie, is the most famous case where she died. So he always kind of blamed himself for that, understanding how genes work, looking at plant biology. All right, so from Darwin's dangerous ideas of natural selection, many theorists, many new fields in academia emerge from this. One of the fields is sociology, and the father of sociology is Herbert Spencer. So Herbert Spencer took Darwin's idea and applied it to society. He applied it to humans. And the way he applied it was looking at societies, groups of people, countries, and looking at their economic system. And his application of this is saying, well, we have the poor, we have a middle class, and we have the wealthy. And therefore, to explain why this happens, why we have different economic classes, why we have different social classes, This is explained using science that those that work harder are thus more intelligent and are able to survive. So this is where the term, this phrase comes: survival of the fittest. So he starts categorizing from looking at agrarian traditional societies to looking at modernity. And he starts putting people in. He starts putting societies in a hierarchy. This is the beginning of a hierarchy. So in this era, what is going on in the 18th and 19th century, many historical things are taking place, and the main question is asking if all humans are equal. And for this, I'm going to pause here and introduce Dr. Lopez, so he can give you just a brief historical summary of this era. So, because from this, we're gonna see how these ideas of putting people, of categorizing humans in hierarchy. In the case of Herbert Spencer, we have the hierarchy based on the economic system, and so forth. Let me pause here.
All right. Hello. So let me then explain what Professor Martinez was actually going through, explaining Darwinism, the ideas of Charles Darwin, now applied to sociology. In this case, the sociologist Herbert Spencer, who is going to take Darwin's ideas about evolution and survival of the fittest, natural adaptation, again, as a natural mechanism of survival, if you will, and reproduction, how those ideas are going to be applied to society. Now, I'm not going to necessarily explain Herbert Spencer's ideas just exclusively on that, but rather just trying to explain why it was so significant, the ideas of Herbert Spencer of trying to apply Darwin's ideas to society in terms of seeing society as a pyramid or a hierarchy of groups, classes, and races, all stacked together again from superior to less superior all the way to the bottom, inferior. Why the need to start dividing people in such a hierarchical fashion? In other words, whether there were social classes, once again, or so-called quote-unquote races or groups of people in general. So let me then turn to the slide here and explain just very briefly what really was going on during this time that led Herbert Spencer and other people that actually supported Spencer's ideas to actually endorse the ideas of the survival of the fittest that Charles Darwin presented and apply it to the human kingdom, to humanity, that is to say, that among humans, there are those that are the survival of the fittest, that they are indeed superior. So they're on top of society. They're on top of a hierarchy, if you will, of society. Even though Charles Darwin never really suggested any of that, again, there will be other people that use Darwin's ideas to suggest that notion again. Okay, so very quickly, this, again, attempt to organize society in a map, if you will, of hierarchies, if you will, in terms of people grouped together as, once again, superior at the very top of the pyramid to less superior and inferior at the bottom of the pyramid. Again, this is really, again, an attempt by intellectuals, some scientists as well, but also some political and economic groups, to counter the argument that was gaining a lot of momentum that was coming out from the Enlightenment, again, the argument that came from Europe during the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment, again, is the 1700s. It is an age when there were a series of thinkers and philosophers that introduced the notion of equality to the world, that indeed all humans are indeed equal. Again, so this is a novel idea, because when you look at history prior to the 1700s, all over the world, people did not think in terms of equality. People accepted the notion that humans were not really created equal, that some humans were considered to be better, superior, more intelligent, for example, than other human beings. And where will we find those human beings? The superior ones? Well, always, again, in positions of leadership, whether it was religious leadership or political, economic, landowners, for example, monarchs, the nobility, for example, the upper echelons of the church, for example, they were considered to be the leaders of society. They were supposed to be better, or considered to be better, because they had certain charisma, they had certain intelligence, they had a certain connection with God or the gods, for example, that enabled them to rise to the top of society. So people accepted that notion, that this was the natural order of society, that some people were simply superior, or that had supernatural qualities, superhuman qualities, and they were on top of society. They were the leaders, in other words. But in the Enlightenment, in the 1700s, there will be a series of philosophers in Europe, particularly philosophers coming from places like France, for example, that suggested that, well, we are all human. We're all equal because we humans possess one single quality that distinguishes us from all other creatures on earth. And that quality is the quality of reason. Okay, so the Enlightenment, this philosophical movement, again, of the 1700s, introduced for the first time the idea that reason, the capacity to understand why things happen in the world, that's reason, that we can actually inquire in the world of nature, for example, or in the world of human beings, and pretty much understand why things happen. The big question is why. That is reason. We have the capacity to understand why things happen. We can investigate, we can inquire, we can analyze things and try to understand, and in many cases understand, why things happen in the world, why there's rain, why there's disease and epidemics, why there are catastrophes or floods, droughts, you name it, that we can actually understand that by studying the world around us, the world of nature with our senses again. It's reason, that is to say. So reason, again, is a quality that every human being possesses. And according to the Enlightenment thinkers, that was considered the highest expression of nature. Rationality, human rationality. It's almost like what the Enlightenment thinkers will compare to, let's say, the soul, that, why we're human? Well, we're human because we possess reason, that is to say. Reason was conceived as something that was a gift from God, in other words, or a gift from nature, if you will. The highest gift that any creature can possess is the gift of reason. So we need to cultivate it, in other words. Yes, we do have reason, but we need to develop it, we need to cultivate it, and the way to do it is through school. For example, we need to go to school, and any human being, doesn't matter what human being it is, that is to say, has the capacity to develop their own rational faculties if they have proper schooling. If you go to school, if you learn how to read, write, if you are trained in philosophy, in the arts and sciences and so on, then you can develop reason, then you become a rational, fully rational human being. Everybody has reason, but we need to awaken it. We need to develop it, in other words. So we're all equal. From that standpoint, again, the Enlightenment thinkers are saying, well, every human being pretty much is on an equal footing. There is no really differences among humans. The only difference is that, well, some people have received more education than others, but that's the only difference. Okay, some people have received more training, more training in mathematics or philosophy, science, history, whatnot. Again, that is the only difference. But we all have the capacity to pretty much rise to the top of society and see the whole landscape. Being able to understand the world, and we have the capacity to analyze it, to understand it, and so on. So there are no differences among human beings according to the Enlightenment idea. So what this is going to do, particularly in the West, what we mean about the West is, again, Europe, for example, and the American continent, again, is this going to inspire a series of struggles for universal equality. Because if the Enlightenment indeed is really saying this, again, that we're all human, that there's no real difference between us, that there's no superior humans or inferior humans, because we all have the capacity to reason, then we, as human beings, have to be given the same rights, the same voice, the same opportunities to participate in the world of politics, in the economy, in every area of human life and human activity, that all humans must be allowed to fully blossom, in other words, and participate in society. So we see struggles for universal equality. Some of those struggles translated into revolutions. For example, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Some of the things that we see, for example, in the American Revolution, in the Declaration of Independence, for example, is the idea that, again, in the opening statement of the Declaration of Independence, is that all men are created equal. Of course, the wording "men," of course, suggested human beings, because people at that time, whenever they suggested or they talked about humans, more often than not, they will use the word man. But in reality, what Thomas Jefferson, again, the author of the Declaration of Independence, was actually suggesting, again, it was the new idea of the Enlightenment, that people, again, all people have the same rights, that we are created equal, and that we have been given certain rights by nature, the right to life, liberty, and property, that is to say. Those are rights given to us by nature. So we see, for example, already the ideas of the Enlightenment, having an impact in the way people are trying to free themselves from certain institutions like the monarchy, for example. They're trying to gain freedom from monarchies, from the church, from nobility, and they're trying to create a new state. They're trying to create a new kind of nation that is going to provide people with rights, that is to say. That happened in the American Revolution and in the formation of the United States, and also in France, in the French Revolution of 1789. The same process, again, people rose up against their monarchs and the church in order to create a new nation based on, again, civil rights, or in this case, natural rights, as it was called. So we see new constitutions being implemented, being written, that provided, of course, a Bill of Rights. So this is the very first time, again, that people are being given rights, not because those rights were given to them, but that it was acknowledged that as human beings, we all do have those rights by nature, in other words. So just the very presence of, again, constitutions that had Bill of Rights, whether it's the American Constitution, the French Constitution, even the British Constitution, in the very first constitutions in world history that are actually saying, look, we're all human, everybody has pretty much the same rights, again, was a big step in this struggle for universal equality. It was not really the end of the struggle, it was just the beginning of the struggle, if you will, because after that, again, we're going to see women also trying to gain the same rights as men as well. We see the women's rights movement. That's another expression of this struggle for universal equality. Women in the very beginning of the United States or the French Republic, the British, for example, system, couldn't vote, okay? They couldn't vote, and in many cases, they couldn't even hold property as well. Again, they were denied again property rights. So women are going to start. They started to get more organized, and what they want is to have the same rights as men. Political rights. They want to hold office. They want to vote. They want to own property. They want to be treated equally. They want also equal pay at the workplace and the like. We see also another struggle for universal equality, abolitionism. Again, the struggle to abolish slavery. In the United States is going to be a big push, particularly by the northern states, to abolish the slavery in the U.S. Constitution and free millions of slaves that were in bondage, of course, in the South, of course. So we see the abolitionist movement. It was not only occurring in the United States, it was also occurring in Europe. We see an abolitionist movement also sweeping across Europe. And by 1830, we see a great number of different countries in Europe that were already moving in this direction, abolishing slavery as well. There's yet another struggle for equality, and that was economic equality. In other words, that it was not enough to provide equality to all people politically, having the same rights, like the right to vote, the right to hold office, and the like. But rather, there was also a push to create what is called economic equality as well. In Europe, there's going to be a movement, otherwise known as communism, in which people wanted also some form of equality, economic equality. When it comes to economics, they wanted to end the great disparities of wealth, and they're trying to abolish social classes. That was communism, in other words. So the significance of all of those movements, whether it is the revolutionary movements that gave us the Bill of Rights, like the American French revolutions, for example, or the women's rights movement, or the abolitionist movement, or even communism, is that what they all share in common, even though they're all very different from one another, of course, what they all share in common is that what we see is a big wave on the rise, starting in the 1700s and into the 1800s. And that wave is a wave to create equality among people, among human beings. In other words, to treat people equally, to give them the same opportunities, economic opportunities, whether it's for, accessing resources or equal pay, owning land, for example, or political access, again, to power as well, like the right to vote, holding office and the like. So we see, again, this idea of equality gaining more and more and more strength and force, both in Europe and in the United States. Now, of course, this is the general background when Herbert Spencer is going to now come forth and present his own ideas about hierarchy. In other words, that, maybe, this idea of universal equality is not all that scientific, because what he's going to be proposing is that indeed there are significant differences among human beings. This is what he's actually proposing, Herbert Spencer. So he's going to try to counter, of course, the ideas of equality by using some scientific theories, some scientific ideas or findings, and trying to use them to counter, once again, the ideas of equality. And why is that? Is because there were significant problems that universal equality was actually facing, significant challenges or obstacles, that is to say. And it was not that easy to simply come forth and just say, look, all humans are created equal. We are all alike because we all possess reason. We have the same faculties of rationality and analysis. We can actually, through education, pretty much rise to our highest potential and the like. We should be treated equally, politically, economically, socially, everywhere, okay? The greatest obstacles or problems to this idea of universal equality was precisely that during this time, we're going to see the rise of an economic system that was becoming pretty much dominant, both in Western Europe and also in North America. And that it was, of course, capitalism. In a nutshell, what this economic system, by the way, this is a new economic system. that was just flourishing. It started flourishing in the 1700s in England, and it started spreading into other parts of Europe like Holland, France, Germany, and it was also coming into the United States by the 1800s. And it was becoming really the mainstream official economic system of an entire country, in this case, the US or Great Britain, France, Holland, Germany, for example. What this economic system actually is all about, in a nutshell, is an economic system that creates this economic liberty, if you will, for people to generate money, to build wealth, to generate wealth, is wealth generation, that is to say. That is the purpose of capitalism, that human beings, again, through hard work and personal responsibility and discipline, that you can actually, again, rise to the top of society, economically speaking. You can, become wealthy, that is to say, okay? So capitalism, of course, led to the rise also of social classes, because that not just everybody had the same opportunities to rise to the top of the ladder. There will be those that will rise to the top of the ladder. They will become the wealthy, for example, the wealthy class. There will be some of people that will rise to the middle. They will become the middle class, of course. They had less means, less resources than the wealthy. And yet, there will be a large group of people that will simply remain at the bottom, at the very base, again, of society. And that will be the working class, the industrial workers, that is to say, that will earning, again, subsistence wages, that is to say, okay? So this was a problem with equality, or for equality, because if you're trying to create equality, but yet we're functioning under a system that creates social classes or disparities of wealth, we have the vast majority on the bottom of society, some in the middle, and very few on the top. Again, that really poses an issue to equality. I mean, what to do with capitalism if indeed we are trying to pursue an egalitarian society in which all people are treated equally and have the same opportunities and rights. How do we reconcile those two different ideas? Universal equality with capitalism that pretty much creates a hierarchical, pretty much structure in society in the way that I just explained. The other obstacle or problem for actually creating an egalitarian society was the fact that during this time, the late 19th century, Europe was in a new course of trying to establish a series of colonies in different parts of the world. We see a series of European empires, in other words, now moving into places like Africa in the latter part of the 19th century. They're also moving into Asia, establishing more and more dominant relationships also in Asia, colonizing certain regions as well, like India or Southeast Asia, for example. And also they're making, of course, their dominant presence in the Middle East as well. So again, that also presented another problem or obstacle, is that how do we reconcile, universal equality, this idea that we should all have this, society in which all people are treated equally and so on, with the fact that now we have a series of empires, European empires, that are actually colonizing different areas of the world, in which the colonized, in this case, whether those the peoples of Africa, Asia, and so on, do not have the same standing. They don't have the same rights as the colonizers, in other words, okay? So there is an unequal relationship between the empire and the colony, of course. Those are not equal. The mother country or the empire and the colony are not pretty much entering into an equal relationship with one another. This is, of course, very unequal. So this is where Herbert Spencer is coming in to justify, in this case, capitalism on one hand, as a benevolent system or a natural system, if you will, and also European imperialism. Okay, so the way he justified it is by suggesting that equality was not natural. This idea that we're all equal or that we were all created equal just because we have reason. Herbert Spencer is directly countering that idea or that argument, completely. He's countering. He's not really supporting. So he's here to provide a legitimate justification for the existence of classes, in this case, social classes, why some people are workers at the bottom of society, why some people are middle class, and why very few are wealthy. And he's also trying to justify, in this case, European imperialism. In other words, why some societies are dominant in the world, why we have empires, in other words, that are dominant over other peoples. So again, his idea is that, taking the ideas from Charles Darwin of the survival of the fittest, he's simply just appropriating Darwinism. He's appropriating the ideas of natural selection and survival of the fittest and saying, well, if we apply the ideas of the survival of the fittest to humanity, then we can see that not all humans are created equal. In fact, some people are the survival of the fittest. They are more intelligent, they're more courageous, they have more charisma, they are more rational or more analytical, and the reason why there are those individuals, again, are on top of society is precisely because they possess the higher qualities of courage, of strength, they possess the higher qualities of intelligence, and so on. And so they have risen to the very top of society. They are the wealthy, they are the empires, if you will. Okay, they are the survival of the fittest. So this is natural. What he said is that, as a matter of fact, if you're trying to organize society as everybody being equal, that is an unnatural way of actually organizing society, because in reality, the way nature works is that some organisms are more evolved than others. Okay, the survival of the fittest are organisms that have proved to be more courageous, more strong, more intelligent, and so therefore they naturally rise to the very top of society, to positions of leadership. In other words, whether it's leadership in the economy, leaderships in politics, doesn't matter. But those that are at the very top, they are the survival of the fittest. And the people that are below them, whether it's the middle class or the industrial workers or colonized peoples, as a matter of fact, what he says is, well, there's a reason why they're there, he said. Why some people are lagging behind in the economy, why they're not rising to the top. Well, it's about the survival of the fittest, because maybe they're not struggling enough. They're not working hard enough. They're not disciplined. They're perhaps lacking certain qualities of intelligence or discipline or courage, strength, etc. And naturally, they tend to fall behind all the way to the floor, if you will, of society. So again, Herbert Spencer was this kind of intellectual that the current systems of his age, the current economic and political systems of his age needed to justify the existence, again, of both capitalism and, in this case, European imperialism. Again, that if indeed we're facing a wave of struggles for equality, women, for example, workers are trying to gain equality. We see, of course, the abolition of slavery as well, trying to abolish slavery, everywhere in the world. So we see, again, great movements to provide equality to people. How do we then justify the existence of systems that do not create equality, but rather they create divisions, if you will, in society? That intellectual was Herbert Spencer. Again, he was a sociologist, and all he did was adopt the ideas of Darwin, get the ideas of Darwin of the survival of the fittest, and pretty much said, well, this is the way nature works. So we're not doing anything wrong. In fact, we're doing exactly what nature does. So we're doing something good by having, of course, a system of social classes. This is totally natural. This is the way nature operates. So we're just in tune, in harmony with nature. In other words, that this is the most natural system, possible, of course. Okay, so again, this is very concise, brief explanation as to why Herbert Spencer was so significant during this time. And I just explained in a nutshell how he is countering, of course, the idea of universal equality on one hand, and on the other, he's justifying, again, the existence of systems, economic and political systems, that create hierarchies, in other words. So he's very pro-hierarchy. He's saying that hierarchy is the most natural form of organization in society or in nature. And so he's pretty much creating a new version of Darwinism that is called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, again, is the idea of societies organized hierarchically, and that this was pretty much natural, in other words. Okay, so this is all I have for you as for now. Now let me turn your attention to Professor Martinez. Okay, thank you.
All right, class. So following up on Dr. Lopez's explanation of Herbert Spencer, and as you know, we're covering how this field of anthropology emerged and these ideas that help create these fields of study. So bridging off from, the changes that were going on, the scientific revolution, Charles Darwin, and how Herbert Spencer appropriated Charles Darwin's ideas and observations of nature to apply them to society, to economic systems. Now, this Dr. Lopez's lecture also reveals what was the mindset of the time, what were the debates, what was going on, the emerging systems such as capitalism, the expansion of European empires and colonizations, and they were colonizing places such as Africa, India, and so forth. And so there was a debate going on at this time while these new systems were emerging and creating divisions and hierarchy, systems of power within society. At this time, when Herbert Spencer's idea, his theory using science, he came about and said, well, we have scientific proof that these societies, this way that humans organize, are very natural. And therefore, these hierarchical systems, based on their economic status, their development, their infrastructure, fall into play. This is correct. We can structure society and humans in this form, in a hierarchy. Let me go back to the slide. Let's see, excuse me. All right. And so during Spencer's time, there were arguments and debates on bringing awareness of looking at humans as equals. At this time, there were the abolishment of slavery, questioning, debating that women also had rights. In other cases, debating worker rights and bringing to the light these inequality and of worker conditions and worker wages and so forth, and asking ideas of what we would call communism were coming into play by Marx, presenting that everyone should have equal access and rights to resources. And in the case, of women in slavery, they're saying, they have rights and they should have access to be treated equally. So Herbert Spencer, his idea presented the validation for systems of power to apply inequality. It validated and justified the rise of capitalism, the emergence of capitalism, and how it would make such economic systems put them in a hierarchy compared to other undeveloped or agriculture societies, and so forth. So from here, we'll go to the father of anthropology. So now you understand Herbert Spencer and what was going on at the time. He was the first to take Darwin's ideas and apply them to humans. And from this emerged a series of justifications for unjust ideas such as racism. All right, so in anthropology, Edward B. Taylor is recognized as the father of anthropology. And what Edward Taylor, he's considered an armchair anthropologist because he collected second accounts from encounters, from the missionaries, from other travelers, and so forth, to try to piece together stories and try to understand other cultures. And before we get into how he applied it, let's look at the recognition that he has. And so you have to understand at this time the field of anthropology or sociology were not there. They became of interest in academia, and as Herbert Spencer began the study of sociology, Edward Taylor was interested in studying belief systems, different culture and their religion or their belief systems. And so therefore, the way he went about it was not doing firsthand work, but he collected memoirs. And as we noted in the previous slides, how these memoirs came about from missionaries, well, it depends on their perspective and their encounter. For those missionaries, such as in the case of Landa, that were on this idea, this mission that they must convert, that they must save these demonic, these people, these indigenous people from these demonic practices and so forth. There were other debates for missionary if these indigenous cultures were humans. They questioned if they would reach a state of being human. And yet we have other missionaries such as Bartolomé de las Casas that also worked with indigenous cultures, that he would come and debate other missionaries like Landa in Spain and say, yes, they are humans, they have souls, and they should be treated with respect. They should be recognized. Their practices, they are not demonic. They are not, they should be protected from the abuse of these conquistadores and other colonization practices. So from these type of accounts, getting the second-hand accounts on different cultures and their practices, this is where Edward Taylor gathers information about their belief system and creates like a linear, a hierarchical, a structure for bringing about this explanation using Darwin's theory on evolution, saying, well, this is how man has evolved, human have evolved. And we can see this looking at their belief systems. So for those cultures, for those people that believe in animism and looking at nature as nature having a spirit, as nature being animated, to have agency, to have willpower, to looking at the belief in their ancestors and that they live among them and so forth, conducting ritual practices, practicing magic and so forth. Taylor would view them as this is the example of primitive men. And from this type of primitive men have humankind evolved into, and the second one is still those humans that have organized religion, whether they have one god, they're monotheistic, or they have many gods, polytheistic. Nonetheless, they still have these ideas that their their ancestors had, and of these ideas of superstitious. So while they have organized religion and an organized structure, they are at a second level of evolution, but nonetheless, they still have a superstitious mind because they believe in spirits or a god, and they have these practices. All right, and then lastly, and what was going on at the time with this idea of science and justifying why things are the way they are, and why certain humans should be treated as superior to others, from humans to structures to economic structures. Taylor presents as a civilized humans are those that believe in science, that use empirical methods, the scientific methods, to come to an understanding of how things work, to use mathematics, to use these type of applications. This is civilized men. So in this case, he categorized the evolution. He tried to piece together and present, again, appropriating Darwin's idea to humans, and said that we come from the savage, primitive mind to a civilization, to scientific, rational mind. Okay, so nonetheless, what we have to understand about Edward Taylor is that he opened up this field of understanding, of studying culture and practices and people, and even though he's looking at it in this evolutionary hierarchy, and it is of course not acceptable, nonetheless he opened up the field of anthropology. So by the 20th century, this field is growing, and more people are intellectuals, in particular, in this case, men were the ones that were having access to education. And coming from wealthy families, they were interested in studying the exotic, and most of them would conduct studies such as Edward Taylor by looking at memoirs and secondhand accounts. Well, Malinowski also came from a wealthy family, and he had his doctorate in mathematics, in physics, and he spoke about 6 languages. So he was an overachiever, we could say. And because this field was very new, and it was what the talk about within elite groups, elite societies, and therefore he suggested that we could start a school of anthropology in Britain. So he set out to conduct field work. Before it's called field work, he set out on a voyage, and he wanted to be very nuanced, bring in a new contribution. And again, this was an emerging field that people of elite societies were finding very exotic and exciting to learn about. So he set out on this voyage to the Trobriand Islands, which is their islands between Papua New Guinea and Australia. And he had the intention of staying there for a period of time, not so much doing at this time. Other emerging anthropologists, emerging researchers, scholars were doing short visits, kind of like survey work, just quick interviews among Native Americans. So there was very little information about these specific cultures. And so therefore trying to be new in the field, trying to bring something different, he focused on this area. And when he arrived at this time, World War One broke out. And it left him in a situation, because he's a German citizen, he was not able to return to Australia or the UK. And he was technically stuck within these islands for 4 years. But in his 4 years, he set out very determined to create a new, bring a contribution to this field. And one of the things that he's recognized for is creating this methodology that we called field work. While he intended to be there for a period of time, it was not his intention to be there for so long. Nonetheless, this gave him the opportunity to, and really no other choice to, but immerse himself and become part of the everyday practices in these islands. And using his scientific approach to creating something new, he called this field of doing field work ethnography. And he brought about this method of, not only are you to, if you really want to learn about a culture, you have to spend extensive time with them and learn their language, learn their everyday practices, learn, in this case he was interested in studying belief systems, look at how they interact and behave, really really integrate yourself within the culture, within the group of people that you're interested in studying, but also participate. So as he learned the language, he also gained access to be able to participate in many of the ceremonies and rituals. And from this, his contribution to anthropology is bringing this argument. He argued Taylor's theory. And remember, Taylor's looking at traditional groups of people, non-European cultures, as primitive, because they use ritual practices, they use magic, they use petitions, offerings, and so forth instead of science. They don't have access to technology. And what Malinowski brings to light is saying he rejects Taylor's theory, and in his explanation of practices, he reveals the rationale and logic of why people do certain things. At this time, remember, there's debates on whether, who's human, and who should have rights and a say. And who is on the hierarchy scale. So Taylor's work, Malinowski's work, is the way he presents his findings is bringing about where they are human. Their practices have logic, have rationale, and looking at their use of magic, he says, well, magic, science, and religion are equal. The goal is to have a cause and effect. And just as science uses a scientific methodology to test out something and to create an effect, in this case, the Trobians have long tradition of using practices such as magic, in the case of asking for food, in agricultural practices, harvesting practices, in healing practices. There is a request for cause. There's a cause, there's a request, and there's an effect. And therefore their petition, their practices does have the result that they are looking for. And therefore he finds the equal rationale in using, just as we embark in scientific ideas of the unknown and an application of it, so do the Trobians. And so magic, science, and religion he views them as logical, as rational, and as equal. Okay. All right, so we will stop there, and I'll do a summary again of what we've covered so far. So this is the introduction to theory. We've covered the emergence of this field and the appropriation of Charles Darwin's ideas when he's looking at at natural selection, at the evolution of from a simple organism into a complex, and how these ideas are appropriated and start being applied to humans, and in many cases using this as a justification for inequality among societies, and in Edward Taylor's case, using it as presenting a justification for evolutionary scale of human beings from primitive to civilized. And then we have the emergence of new scholars coming into the field and debating this, bringing in new methods, and he really revolutionized this field and gave rise to this field in academia by conducting detailed ethnographic work where he kept a detailed description of what he was observing, by participating, bringing the idea that in order to be able to understand, you must immerse yourself. And later on, his work was questioned and within the Trobriand Islands, and his work was not so much debated. What later on, when we look at the debates in anthropology, his diaries were published by his second wife and caused quite controversy, because Milanowski became a very renowned figure in anthropology. And remember, he's socializing with these elite groups, and he's creating a new field of study, creating emerging on this new academic discoveries. And so this really hurt his reputation later on, his diaries. All right, so we will stop there, and we'll continue with other theorists and their contributions to anthropology. Thank you.